Good evening, everyone. Welcome to TrickStop's monthly webinar. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Vladimir, TrickStop's clinical lead and the guy that usually does the webinars. Our topic for this evening is boredom, specifically boredom as an emotional state that leads to hair pulling, so boredom as a trigger. When you selected this topic last month, I was initially quite excited because boredom is something that I read about and hear about daily from my clients, and specifically boredom as a trigger is something that many of my clients will tell me about. And I will always get into this back and forth where I explain that I don't quite believe in boredom in the sense that I think there's more to that than just saying, okay, so this is what triggers me, goodbye. And I always feel like there's a kind of reluctance to get into the experience of boredom and why it triggers. So when this topic was selected, I was quite happy because I thought finally now we'll dive in. And also I'll have an excuse to actually read a bunch of research and works on boredom so that I can have a theoretical framework, to approach this with. Because usually when you work as a therapist, you're not so much concerned with how a scientist or a philosopher is defining anything. You're really interested in what your client is telling you. So when you tell me, any one of you, when any one of you says boredom, that's what I need to figure out, like what that is to you. And so as many clients as I have, that many kinds of boredoms do I have. So that's usually how I treat it. And then I thought, well, maybe I can take this opportunity and then just expand my knowledge a little bit and read up on research, perhaps some neuroscience on boredom, because I thought it would be fascinating. And I was very unpleasantly surprised when I figured out that there's almost no research available. I found about a dozen studies, not more, most of which weren't particularly useful for us. So in the end, as you can see, I did manage to piece together a webinar, but it's going to be a rather eclectic one. So we'll kind of do a little survey of boredom, how different people define boredom, what it implies, what does it mean, and then in the end, I'll give you a few practical tips in terms of what to do when you feel bored. I would invite you to use everything I give you in this webinar maybe as an invitation to think about how that relates to you and does it relate to you, because certainly not everything will and not everything can. So choose what works for you, what resonates. If you feel resistance to an idea, there's something to explore. If you find yourself attracted to an idea or a definition of boredom, again, there's something to explore. So use these as starting points and then come up with your own understanding and your own definition of boredom. Because ultimately, whatever the books say and whatever the scientists say and whatever the philosophers say, that's them and you're you. So you have to customize it for yourself. And as you will see, I will disagree with plenty of what I have to say. And as usual, I can't really keep my opinions to myself, so I will point out where I disagree and why I disagree with it. Mainly as it kind of differs from my clinical experiences or from why I need a theory of boredom. So I'm not particularly interested in, whether boredom is creative or whether boredom is this or that. So if we're talking about boredom as a trigger, that's not quite interesting to me. Before I start the webinar, I want to share something with you. I read a very interesting study. It didn't really give me anything useful clinically, but I thought it was a wonderful illustration as to how averse we are to being bored. So the study was done at Harvard, I believe, and it kind of measured exactly how much boredom you can put up with. So they would put people in a room and just tell them your job is to sit at this table and do nothing. And there was a button on the table, and the scientists told them, whatever you do, don't press the button because you will shock yourself with electricity. And if you don't press the button for a certain period of time, we will give you money. So you'll get a reward. essentially what they were trying to do is to see whether they can bribe you into not being bored, or to bribe you into being with boredom. At the end of the experiment, it turns out about every fourth woman pressed the button to shock herself, and wait for it, over 60% of men decided to rather shock themselves than sit and be bored. I mean, this is not a clinically useful piece of information, but I thought it was wonderfully illustrative that over half of the people would rather electrocute themselves than be bored. So I think that immediately right there tells you that boredom is probably a trigger for many other things, not just hair pulling. So with that said, let's start by kind of putting boredom into a context and then defining it. So those are the first two things that we will do. Uh, as always, ask all the questions that you like, and then once I get to the Q&A, I will answer them. If you have to leave by the time I'm done rambling, I will probably answer your question. Just check out the recording afterwards. What else did I want to say? Yes, the poll is open to vote for next month's topic, so make sure to do that as well. Anyways, let's get started. So the first thing that I think is important for you to know about boredom is that it's basically a cultural phenomenon. So there's nothing eternal, objective, or universal about boredom. In fact, the idea that we have about most emotions is always very much culturally based. Sometimes it's produced by the language, sometimes by customs, by lifestyles, and so on. Different aspects of how we organize our cultures. Boredom is actually, according to many researchers and many philosophers, some of whom are really brilliant people, actually quite a recent product. In fact, Adorno and Heidegger both say that boredom is essentially a byproduct of modernity. So it's something that's about like 150 years old. And if you look back at literature that we have, you have boredom figuring prominently in some form in Baudelaire's poetry, for example. You have boredom in, what's her name? Madame Bovary, like what she does, the entire plot of the novel is based on the idea that she just moved to the boring suburbs, and then basically we see where boredom escalates from then on. But when you go back into history earlier, people actually weren't apparently bored, or at least they had different ways of explaining and understanding these states of mind. So for example, Seneca, depicted here on the right, it's a part of a much larger Rubens painting. Seneca talks about this state called tedium vitae, which is like exhaustion with life. It's a state where nothing seems to be meaningful or stimulating, and where life simply doesn't seem worth living because of it. And if you think about it, at the time when Seneca lived, so it's like early imperial Rome, in order to actually experience this, you had to be pretty rich. Because if you had to work your butt off all day to make a living, you really didn't have time to feel, meaninglessness of things in life. So you have to have a certain degree of comfort in order to actually be in the position to feel boredom, which is why these theorists that I mentioned say that boredom is quite a recent phenomenon, because really up until quite recently, people couldn't afford to be bored, right? On a kind of general level, we can say that boredom has to do with our experience of time and then with our experience of meaninglessness. We'll get into both of these a little later. Now, I would like to tell you a little more about boredom as a cultural phenomenon, but in kind of more specific terms. So we'll turn to the Frankfurt School, specifically to one of their theorists, which is Theodor Adorno. If you like classical music, he wrote a lot of very interesting stuff about classical music. And if you like someone to point out how meaningless pop culture is, Adorno's your guy also. So here's what he has to say about boredom. It sounds a bit random, and I promise I will explain what he means. He says the following. Boredom is a function of life which is lived under the compulsion to work and under the strict division of labor. So here's how you can think about that. In order to be bored, you have to have time to be bored. Like if you have to work hard to make ends meet, even if your job isn't particularly fulfilling, you probably don't have time to sit there for 3 hours and, think how everything is meaningless. So boredom is something that will happen in your free time, in leisure time. Right. So when you have leisure time as opposed to work, it's only if work is the central aspect of your life. And if you think about it, most of us on this call, I'm sure, spend at least a third or even more of our lives working. So our lives, because we live at a certain time, in a certain cultural moment, our lives are in one way or another organized around work. So that's what Adorno means. So you have to have work as this kind of main pillar of your life in order to have leisure time, supposedly free time. And then in that free time is when boredom will arise. Because Adorno was a social critic and he was kind of interested in the way in which economic systems shape our sense of self, he believed that in capitalism, free time isn't as free as we'd like it to be. So it's not that you're oppressed directly by someone, but what he says is that leisure time for capitalism is really just time where they can sell you more stuff. So even your free time, in a sense, is commodified. Like you have different ways that you pay for to fill up your free time. So in a sense, your freedom is centered around work, which makes it quite limited. So not not as free. And then even your leisure time, that supposedly free time, is actually given to you. And we all like to think that we're quite different, and we are. Like I've never heard two life stories in therapy that are the same, but there are patterns that we all have. It doesn't matter how introspective or intelligent we are. It is highly, highly likely that once you get to work, you'll do something, then you'll sit and stare at Netflix for a period of time, or you will scroll on your phone. Because scrolling on social media, reading the news and getting upset by it, or watching Netflix is a pattern that is served to us. People talk about Netflix as if it was always present, whereas it's really a new thing. But it's kind of given to us in a way that we just take it. We think it's our choice, but it's only our choice because we have such limited range of choices. So according to Adorno, that's a consequence of living in capitalism, that even your free time will be commodified, right? So we have this situation that your life is about work, even when you're off work, because everything is centered around work, right? Your free time is not actually that free, since the structure is already provided to you. And then even your choices, how you will fill out that free time, are given to you, predefined. Right? We don't feel it that way because we just go about our lives. We don't think, here is this thing predefined by, the market economy. Who goes around thinking like this? But it is in effect what Adorno says happens. And listening to people's stories all day, every day, it does make sense to me, right? So even that is a product. And so when boredom occurs, it's because everything that you're offered, everything that's on the market for your leisure time, is not meaningful enough. So Adorno would say that boredom is not just this state when, we deal with the ideas of time and meaninglessness as the previous person did. For him, boredom has this very strong political component. It can be politically used, I guess. It's a yearning for freedom. It says, get me out of this ridiculous system that I'm in. I don't want any of these options that you're offering me. So in that sense, even though it's a very unpleasant time, an unpleasant emotion, boredom has a kind of emancipatory potential. And if Frankfurt School is not your cup of tea, I will offer another approach to boredom, which is quite different, that also has a similar component, which is that we can see boredom as this kind of very unpleasant, oppressive state of mind, but we can also see it as something that is potentially about to transform us and change us. And as you will see, that's frequently where the problems with boredom actually start. So if you look at boredom this way, this is a very critical way of looking at boredom. When I say critical, I mean critical of the society that we live in. This is from the 50s, I think, and it's still very much, I think, good criticism of society. But if you want to step aside from that, if you want to have one takeaway here, is that in a very weird way, boredom is a privilege. As you will see later on, there are philosophers who think it's a privileged state of mind, a privileged emotion, which is a different thing. But it is a privilege in the sense that we have to have the ability to have leisure time at all in order to be bored. So you have to have time that you fill up with meaningless activities, which is not the case everywhere in the world, even right now, not to mention historically. So that's one way to look at boredom in a kind of wider context. But what exactly is it? It's like, what is that state of mind? Sadly, there's really no agreed upon definition of boredom. I found several, and I will offer most of them to you today, so you can choose what resonates with you the most. In fact, because it's so hard to define, I think that's a part of why researching boredom is so difficult, because you can't quite measure or experiment with a concept that you can't pinpoint. You can't compare your results to anyone else's because you're really not sure if they're talking about the same thing, right? We have issues, for example, in mindfulness research with that as well, but this is, I think, an even bigger problem. It's very hard to break it down into components that you can measure. It's very frequently seen as just a kind of aversive experience of kind of wanting without being able to engage in a satisfying activity. So essentially, it means that whatever you're engaged in, you don't quite want to be engaged in it anymore, but you're not able to be engaged in doing something else. But at least to me, this is a very vague way of approaching boredom, because I can say that now I would really like to be engaged in reading a book that I was reading half an hour before this webinar, but that does, and I can't because I'm obviously doing this webinar, but that doesn't mean that I'm bored, because I'm not bored at all. So I think that's one that's one problem with this way of defining boredom. This quote here is from a paper that I will show you, and if you want to read the whole paper, I can send it to you because it's available for free, and I have it on my hard drive somewhere. Here's the quote. So, in modern psychology, boredom has been considered largely inconsequential for human functioning, a fleeting state that results from monotonous tasks or limited external stimulation. I disagree with this for several reasons. First of all, I disagree that boredom is inconsequential. You have studies that show that boredom can be followed by bursts of creativity, so that's not inconsequential. If boredom triggers you to pull your hair, it's most certainly not inconsequential. So modern psychology kind of missed the mark there, I believe. I think also saying that it results from monotonous tasks is not quite true. And I guess the only thing I have to offer there is my personal experience. I've talked about mindfulness so many times, but I focus on my breath twice a day for 45 minutes, and it's all I do for 45 minutes, and I never find it boring. And it is quite monotonous because that's the only thing I do, but I just don't find it boring. So in that sense, I don't think monotony, maybe it's a component for some people, but I don't think it's a universal trait of boredom. And then the thing that bugs me the most is the idea that boredom comes from limited external stimulation. This is the case for many people, I'm absolutely certain. Many of my clients will precisely say that. When I ask them, so how do you understand your own boredom? What does that mean to you? They will usually say that they feel understimulated and that they don't have anything that will stimulate them. The reason why I don't like this is because, again, in my own personal experience, I don't fall into that category. So either I'm truly never bored, which is I mean, I'm not prone to boredom, but it's still not likely that I'm never bored. But for me, in absence of external stimulation, my brain will cook up stories and all kinds of alternative worlds, and it's never boring inside my head. So, in that sense, if I don't have external stimulation, I'll find internal stimulation. And to say that there is no stimulation whatsoever, I also think is not right because, I mean, pardon the weird example, but unless you're dead, I hardly see how is it possible that there are no stimuli for anything around you. I think what may be the case is that we relate to stimuli in a specific way, and then it either does or doesn't produce boredom. I will tell you about that a little later because that's my theory. I'm currently presenting someone else's. One second. Okay, so this is a very short definition of boredom, and I quite like it. It's a vague one, but I really like it. This is Tolstoy, and this is his definition. He says boredom is a desire for a desire, and I really like this because it kind of resonates with, again, a lot of the experiences that I hear every day, but it also resonates with how I feel boredom sometimes. It's kind of like you're sitting there and you just wish you were passionate about something in that moment. It's not even that it has to be grand or amazing in any way. It's just something that you can invest your capacities in. I see that like at least 3 or 4 of you have raised your hands. Just put the question in the Q&A. Apparently Tolstoy is quite stimulating for you. So just put the question in the Q&A and I will get to that at the end of the webinar when we do our regular Q&A session. So in that sense, the question, if you follow Tolstoy's thinking, the question that you have to ask yourself when you're bored, if you want to resolve boredom, is what is it that I should be desiring right now? Or what am I desiring, I guess, because desire for a desire is kind of very meta. But it does say that boredom is a state of mind that kind of tells us that there's something missing. Inside, outside, that's a question of a specific person, but it says that we don't have anything that drives us anymore, and we need to be driven by something. So hence the desire for a desire. So let's go back to that paper. This was like a random interlude with a nice quote. I was also happy to find an actual photograph of Tolstoy in color. It's quite remarkable. So following this paper, so it was published in 2013, and it talks about the function of boredom. So what is boredom according to these authors? They say, specifically, we argue that boredom arises from the perception that the current situation is no longer stimulating, as reflected in the diminishing emotional response to the situation. I have problems with internal consistency of this paper to a degree, because here they say, like, if boredom is an emotion, then it cannot be a diminishing emotion. But I kind of understand what they mean to say here, which is that boredom is a kind of flat emotional state. Whereas if you're sad or happy, they're kind of dynamic and all kinds of things are happening in your mind and in your body. Whereas with boredom, you don't have these fluctuations. There's no up and there's no down. It's like a flat line. But what I think is very important in this definition, and what I just mentioned previously that I don't like in their definition of boredom as lacking external stimulation, is this. They say it arises from the perception that the current situation is no longer stimulating. So boredom has nothing to do with objective circumstances that we're in, and it has everything to do with how we interpret the situation that we're in. Which I guess explains the fact that, for example, I mentioned Netflix. I don't own a TV, so I never watch TV, for example, because that to me is boring. But I do like to read, and reading books is never boring because to me it's like a very rich experience. Mentally, I like the tactile sensation, I love the smell of books. So to me, that's a very rich, stimulating thing to do. Whereas for someone else, sitting and reading a book could be the very definition of hell. So in that sense, it's not that there's something stimulating or not stimulating objectively about the book. It's more about what meaning we attribute to that situation. So boredom definitely then has something to do with meaning, or as someone said previously, meaninglessness. let's see what else they say. They say boredom then organizes responses to this situation that encourage people to seek alternative goals and experiences, even if those experiences might result in negative emotions. I don't agree that boredom organizes anything. To me, that would be like saying my sadness organized crying. It just makes no sense. You are the agent. I always think of the world, as you probably know if you've been to my previous webinars, from a constructivist point of view. And the kind of constructivism that I like and advocate for is called personal constructivism. And there we are always seen as agents who make meaning and then apply it to the world. So boredom is, in the constructivist sense of the word, is just a piece of information. It's something that comes out and it tells us something about the world or about ourselves. And then we do the organizing based on how we interpret that information. So what they describe here is, I think, an ideal healthy response to boredom, which is that when you feel boredom, you understand that as a signal, as a piece of information that encourages you to seek alternative goals and then basically change the activity that you're engaged in, right? Even if it produces bad emotions. So it just kind of mobilizes you to change. I find, however, that if people are triggered by boredom, then they don't probably have this response to boredom. In fact, they often feel trapped by boredom, so with no meaningful way of alleviating it, and then unable to withstand its weight, because boredom, especially when you're immersed in it for very long periods of time, can be an exhausting, intense feeling. Right, so to put it succinctly, boredom is the emotional indication to pursue an alternative goal. So whatever you're doing, don't, and then do something else. We can distinguish between two types of boredom, at least the way we do that in psychology. I will show you another way to look at boredom and another division or classification of boredom. But typically we think of boredom as state boredom and trait boredom. Trait boredom is boredom as a kind of tendency. It's what when people say I'm prone to boredom, that's what they mean. The quality of the feeling itself is not very different, whether it's a state boredom because you just happen to find yourself in a situation that you can't escape and it's boring. So that would be just the state of boredom. It's exactly the same, as boredom feels to people who have trait boredom, only these people have it more frequently. It's kind of a regular part of their lived experience. So when I say that I'm not a person that experiences a lot of boredom, what I mean is that when I am bored, it's kind of just this state of boredom rather than a tendency. I am not prone to being bored because I tend to act on my feelings. So I never wallow in them, so I don't end up overwhelmed by it. Both of these can be triggers. So if you're thinking about like whether this or that triggers me, it doesn't matter. This division comes into play when you're planning your competing responses, when you're planning your cognitive diffusion, whatever other techniques you may use to stop your pulling. This is where this distinction is important. If you're prone to boredom, then you have to address boredom quite seriously. So you have to have a plan. You have to have an understanding as to what tends to make you feel bored, what doesn't, what kind of stimulation you need if you resonate with the idea that boredom is lack of external stimulation. What's the healthiest way to obtain that? So in that sense, you have a lot of inner work to do in terms of understanding yourself. Whereas the state of boredom is kind of easier to manage and not as frequent. The reason why I put this painting is because I used either this painting or another painting from the same cycle by the same painter. It's by Carmen Herrera, this wonderful Cuban American painter. She passed away recently. And someone commented that because I was saying something how much I like her work, and someone left a comment in the Q&A, I don't understand how you can like this. This is the most boring thing I've ever seen. So I remember that, and then I put it here. That person obviously has never seen Malevich's art if they think this is boring. So anyway, think of that in terms of two boredoms and try to figure out which one is yours. Boredom as a tendency can happen just because, I don't know, you grew up in a specific way and then kind of developed this tendency, but it can also be associated with some clinical conditions. So if you have proneness to boredom, please don't diagnose yourself based on what I'm going to say. But if you have any of the issues that I'm about to mention and you've been diagnosed by someone, then you can make the connections that need to be made. For example, people who have ADHD tend to have proneness to boredom, but not everyone who's prone to boredom has ADHD. With ADHD, what brains of people with ADHD crave is some kind of stimulation. So whenever they lack very active stimulation or many sources of stimulation, then they tend to become bored. So that's sometimes when you have ADHD, then you're prone to boredom. Another thing where proneness to boredom is quite an important symptom, even though it's a bit neglected in the literature, I think, is borderline personality disorder. In fact, proneness to boredom is very, very frequent with people who have BPD. The extreme to which this proneness to boredom goes is what's often the problem. If you happen to struggle with borderline personality disorder, and if you have to be alone for long periods of time, that can become unbearable, excruciating. Because what boredom brings you in contact with is a kind of feeling that people very frequently describe as emptiness, but not the, compassionate, awesome Buddhist kind of emptiness, but more like this terrible, unbearable state of being empty inside. There are also some studies that I came across where people who report being prone to boredom are much more likely to start drinking or become depressed or anxious or use drugs, all as ways to alleviate boredom and deal with this tendency that they have to become bored. I will explain to you why all these behaviors that I just mentioned function exactly in the same way as hair pulling. They're all in some way manifestations of avoidance of boredom. Whereas boredom can really be a great teacher for us if we just learn how to tolerate it and hear out what it has to say. So here are some effects of boredom. I will not read this whole thing because not everything is equally important. Let's just focus on 2 or 3 points from this table, all from the manifestation part. So boredom is, in this paper that I'm still quoting, defined as kind of being understimulated. So obviously you will have a preference for novel stimuli, for something new. Sometimes that translates into a preference for risk. But that's not this second one is really completely unimportant. This part here is what I think is very important. What happens with your cognition, with your ways of thinking when you're bored? What happens is your mind starts wandering, searching for something that will stimulate it. So when you're bored for a specific period of time, which is, I guess, different for everyone else, your mind just explodes with thoughts. It starts to bring back thoughts, ideas, memories of all kinds. Some irrelevant, some relevant, doesn't matter. But your brain just keeps working and working and working and working and going all over the place. And if you start following it all over the place, it creates very unpleasant internal experiences. And then there's this other thing that I would like to point out, which is the autonomic arousal that happens. So if you're just bored, your autonomic nervous system starts to become activated. And when it starts to become activated, you can experience a number of symptoms. For example, restlessness. For example, your heart can beat a little faster. Your breathing can change. You can start sweating. You can feel itchy all over your skin. You can feel like you can't be in your own skin anymore. And all of it kind of resembles anxiety. When people tell me boredom triggers me, I always start being very annoying without exception, because I start asking them about what the experience of boredom is. And then they usually tell me, what do you mean what the experience of boredom is? Like, what a stupid question you're asking now. I'm just bored. And then I tell them, okay, so what's happening in your mind? What's happening in your body? What thoughts do you have? What sensations can you detect? And then I give them specific instructions on how to listen to their bodies and their mind. And then invariably, they will come back with these two things: mind wandering and this arousal. It's kind of like an accumulation of energy in their bodies. And then these two feed into each other, because when your mind starts wandering, it might go, it might bring back painful memories, traumatic events. It might bring up your schedule, all the things that you haven't done, all the things that you have planned for this week. All of these can make you feel a little bit anxious or angry or sad. All of these feelings obviously have their somatic correlates, so you always feel them in your body in a certain way. And then on this already prepared territory of your body being aroused, these emotions get amplified. And then when they get amplified, then your mind starts thinking even worse thoughts, because our emotional states act as kinds of filters for our thoughts. Like if you're depressed, you will have more negative thoughts by far than the positive ones, because your mood filters out your thoughts. It amplifies some and kind of allows others to fade into the background. So negative emotions such as anxiety or whatever else you might feel will filter your thoughts, and then you'll think even more bad thoughts, and then you get caught up in this cycle. And then boredom often really does escalate as anxiety or tension. If you're feeling very curious and experimental, do this as an experiment. Turn off the TV, turn off your phone, get rid of everything, sit in a dark room, sit on your hands so you can't pull, and just sit there for half an hour and see what happens. It's kind of like the open awareness meditation, I guess, only in a more sadistic way. But you will notice this phenomenon, I'm quite certain. So now we have to move, like this is all nice and well, but I think it's kind of, it sets the stage, but I think it stays also on the surface. So I was looking for some other approaches to boredom that would give boredom a little more psychological depth, because that's at the end of the day what I'm interested in as a therapist. And ironically enough, I found a very good description of boredom in a writer that I consider to be incredibly boring. David Foster Wallace is a writer that I cannot tell you how bored I am by his writing. I've read The Infinite Jest, like cover to cover. I find very little redeeming value in it, and over the years I've become convinced that when people say that they love David Foster Wallace, that they're lying straight to my face, because it's almost incomprehensible to me that someone could possibly appreciate him. Also, I'm really sorry, I'm sure he has a lot of fans, but it's just mind-boggling to me. And this is coming from a person who reads very pretentious literature, like, Polish poetry and Joyce and Proust, and I love DeLillo's Underworld and all of his books, actually. So I read a lot of stuff that people wouldn't define as interesting, but Wallace really just kills me. However, he has a wonderful, wonderful idea about boredom. So I'm going to read all of this, and I promise it's not going to be too boring. Here it goes. To me, at least in retrospect, the really interesting question is why dullness proves to be such a powerful impediment to attention. Why we recoil from the dull. Maybe it's because dullness is intrinsically painful. This alone, I think, is a good idea, to look at boredom as a kind of pain. So maybe that's where phrases like deadly dull or excruciatingly dull come from. But there might be more to it. Maybe dullness is associated with psychic pain because something that's dull or opaque fails to provide enough stimulation to distract people from some other, deeper type of pain that is always there, if only in an ambient, low-level way, which most of us spend nearly all of our time and energy trying to distract ourselves from feeling, or at least from feeling directly or with our full attention. So he says here, maybe boredom, painfully difficult as it is actually there so that we don't experience an even greater pain. So the choice to be bored, if we can put it that way, an unconscious choice, so obviously, is actually a less painful choice, because the alternative, to see what's beneath the surface and what exists, as he says, in an ambient, low-level way, is that much more unbearable than boredom. Admittedly, the whole thing's pretty confusing and hard to talk about abstractly, but surely something must lie behind not just music in dull or tedious places anymore, but now also actual TV in waiting rooms, supermarkets, checkouts, airport gates, SUVs, back seats, Walkman, iPods, Blackberries, cell phones that attach to your head. This terror of silence with nothing diverting to do. I love that sentence, like that phrase, terror of silence with nothing to do. I can't think anyone really believes that today's so-called information society is just about information. Everyone knows it's about something else, way down. I really love this quote, because when I thought about that, when I was thinking about like boredom and how to structure this webinar, this came to my mind, and then I found it and I read it and I thought, this is really brilliant. Because what he's describing here, in a much better way than any psychologist would, is fundamentally that boredom is a barrier that we place, like the last one, when all the other distractions fail, the TVs and the music and the noise that we're surrounded. Boredom is like this last barrier to penetrate into something that is very painful and very much unacceptable to ourselves. Maybe if we stay bored for very long periods of time, that will come flooding back into our consciousness. So boredom tells us that something that's way down is maybe slightly moving towards the surface. I really like this idea. I think this is the last kind of concept of boredom. So Heidegger is, I guess perhaps some of you know, quite a controversial figure as a human being. He was, well, not a role model for sure. But as a philosopher, he's possibly one of the greatest minds that Western philosophy has ever produced. If you've ever tried reading Heidegger, you know why I will not even pretend to understand half of what he says, because it's just truly so brilliant that it's almost impenetrable to me. But he's, of all the philosophers that I could think of, he's the one who wrote about boredom, I think, the most. There are lectures on metaphysics where there's like about 100 pages only about boredom. There are some other philosophers that wrote about boredom in interesting ways, but I decided not to include them here because I didn't want to bore you. And also because, for example, Nietzsche wrote a few interesting things about boredom. But the quotes that I could remember and places where I could remember to look for it, I feel would offend anyone who's religious, because Nietzsche was kind of merciless when it comes to critiquing Christianity. So I didn't want to go there. And Schopenhauer in general, he's the second one. He wrote also a lot about boredom, but he's just a philosopher I find very uninteresting. And this is not supposed to bore me. Heidegger, on the other hand, I find difficult to understand, but quite intriguing. Heidegger says that boredom is a privileged feeling. So remember when I made that distinction as boredom as a form of privilege, but then also boredom as a privileged feeling. And for Heidegger, boredom and anxiety are privileged feelings because they take us to the core of the problem of being, which is not something that I have the capability of solving, so I won't go deeper into that. But this connection between boredom and anxiety should be kind of aware from the scientific paper that I quoted. And then also we'll see, when I give you just briefly a possible constructivist understanding of boredom, you will see that boredom and anxiety are very much intrinsically linked. So Heidegger was onto something quite important here. He distinguishes between three different forms of boredom, and they don't correlate to that other classification of boredom. There's being bored with something. There is then boring yourself with something. And then there's something that is translated as profound boredom, but knowing Heidegger, I'm pretty sure he has like a special German word for it. Profound boredom will not be something that I'll talk about because it's more of an ontological event than anything else. It's something in a league of its own. Whereas these two types of boredoms, I think, are quite easy to bring down to this very earthly, banal level where most of us live our everyday lives. Being bored with something for Heidegger is an active form of boredom. It's when you're actually making an effort to find some kind of meaning in whatever is happening. Because for Heidegger, essentially boredom is this massive loss of meaning. So you're put in this place or in front of something, a task, a situation, a person that bores you, and then you're putting in active effort to fight that, to find something in there that will remove boredom. Boring yourself with something is a much more intriguing kind of boredom, and I find that, again, if there are any philosophers listening to this, I'm sorry for butchering Heidegger, but I am really just using this for my own selfish psychological purposes, which is to help you conceptualize your own boredom. This is not a philosophy lecture. So boring yourself with something is a passive kind of boredom, in the sense that you are not an active participant in trying to deal with the feeling. Boredom happens and you don't do anything about it. In fact, Heidegger says with this kind of boredom, people often don't even know that they're bored. This is really important and very interesting to me, because I find that this is something that is the case with my clients who struggle with BFRBs. Not all the time, but quite frequently, which is that they will tell me, like, I had a good day. And then I say, and then I came home and then I started pulling. And then I would say, okay, well, what's a good day? And then they say, well, nothing bad happened. And I said, okay, but what else? And they was like, well, it was just an ordinary day. And they think, okay, so what does it mean you had an ordinary day? So it started as a good day, then it became not a tragic day, then it became an ordinary day. And then they will tell me, well, nothing meaningful happened, good or bad, which is really boredom. It's just that in the moment when the day unfolds, the person is bored and that boredom takes its toll on you, but you don't have this kind of conscious awareness. It's not an acute state of mind. This is something, I believe that Heidegger uses this example of like going to dinner and then spending time with people and then only realizing that you're bored once you get home. In that case, when you start pulling, it could be because of the boredom that you actually weren't even aware of. Because we live, I'm sad to say, painfully mindless lives. We spend a good deal of our day on autopilot. I think Adorno might agree with this as well, but many people do just crappy jobs. When I say crappy, I don't even necessarily mean in bad conditions. I just mean meaningless jobs. Jobs that are not fulfilling to the person who does it, or for anyone else for that matter. And that does constitute boredom. So if you're bored 8 hours a day at your work and not even know it, then you could be triggered by boredom again and not even know it. The question is whether you're spending your time in a meaningful and mindful way or not. So for Heidegger, boredom removes the illusion of meaning and reveals all the emptiness and nothingness that we live in and that lives inside of us. It's very dramatic, isn't it? And he says, because he does this, it just kind of shatters all these veils, masks, desires, images that we have in our minds, all the shoulds, musts, and all the other nonsense that carries us through life. And then once all that is gone, you face this terrifying nothingness, but then something authentic can emerge. Because if you're really going to become authentic and really take care of yourself and know what your needs are and what your values are and who you are and where you're going and so on, this is also a very superficial interpretation of Heidegger, what I'm giving you here. You kind of have to destroy all the illusions. Let me give you a very, very simple example that's very easy to understand. Just today, I had a session with a client who is 16 years old and was telling me how she pulled her hair all afternoon after she was doing nothing special, just browsing on Instagram. And putting pictures on Instagram. And I told her, so, okay, what was that like for you? And then she kind of moved backwards in her chair and said, well, that's a ridiculous question to ask. Like, what is it like to put pictures on Instagram and to look at other people's pictures? And I said, well, maybe, but I don't use social media as much. And when I say as much, I mean almost at all. So I don't know what it's like. Like, my idea of Instagram is watching pretentious art and architecture and Cocker Spaniels. So I don't really have the experience. And then she says, well, I look at all these people and then I feel bad because I don't look the way that they look. And then I have to Photoshop my own pictures or whatever app she uses so that I can be a certain way. Or as she phrased it, so that I can look the way I should look. So she kind of traps herself into this image of herself. And this image is basically generated by seeing other fake images. And there's a lot of inauthentic nonsense going on there. Because you see a fake image of someone, you believe that's not a fake image, then you create a fake image in response to something you believe is an authentic image, and then you live alienated from yourself because you have to live this, fake life so that you don't show yourself because you don't believe that what you actually are or how actually you see yourself is worthy. So for Heidegger, authenticity only starts when all of that comes crashing down. Just knock it all down. And boredom is an excellent way, according to him, to do that. So he wouldn't tell you to run away from boredom or deal with boredom in any way, not distract yourself from it. He would say, immerse yourself in it, just as deeply as you can. Let boredom shatter everything. I'm aware that not many people will take this advice. I don't even know how to operationalize this, but that is what he would say. Keep in mind also that he's the guy who recommended visiting graveyards all the time so that you can learn to appreciate life, which is advice that I actually like. So let's sum up where we are with boredom so that I don't bore you to tears. There are two different processes that take place when we're bored. There's the psychological and then there's the physiological. On the physiological level, there's arousal in your body, which is not the same as anxiety, but does resemble it and can grow into become anxiety. And then there's a psychological layer, which is this restless mind, and then emotions that get attached once we start clinging to the thoughts that our mind produces. And on this psychological level, what we experience can really be very... it can be really silly in hindsight. Like I remember on one mindfulness retreat that I went to, that it was the second day of the retreat, and the first day went fine, and then for some reason the second day my mind was just all over the place, and I found myself remembering this thing that happened when I was, I think, like 7th grade or something, which was a long time ago. And it was my birthday party, which I always hated because I was always an introvert, and I always thought of birthday parties as just kind of time when everyone else has a good time, whereas I sit there grumpy because I can't wait for people to go so I can read books. And I remember someone gave me a CD as a birthday present, and I looked at the CD and I said something like, thanks, but this is really not my type of music. I didn't say it in a mean way. It wasn't taken the wrong way. I remember the whole thing. The person really didn't seem to care very much. But in that moment, because I couldn't focus on my breath as I was supposed to, my mind was all over the place. I remember that event, and suddenly this enormous guilt kind of overtook me over something so banal and so inconsequential that I think if I were to reach out to that person, I suspect they wouldn't remember it, because that's how irrelevant it is. But when you feel boredom, in that case, it was this just state boredom, not trait. All kinds of things that your mind will try to dig up so that you have some kind of arousal, some kind of reaction, some kind of stimulation. So my brain managed to produce guilt out of something that is just so utterly unimportant. If it hadn't been for that strong feeling of guilt, I probably wouldn't even remember that right now. So these two layers of experience that take place while we're bored feed into each other and amplify each other, which is why boredom tends to get worse the more you're immersed in it. I hope this is clear. And just from this, you can kind of start dissecting your experience very easily. And because of this kind of tendency of our mind to dig up all kinds of stuff, boredom has a way of confronting us with our deepest fears and insecurities. And when we have a hard time dealing with emotions as it is, and this kind of almost existential dread comes up, we will likely try to escape. And this is where the triggering part starts, and this is where the terrain for pulling has already been set. Here's how that works. Imagine the Netflix situation, let's say. So you come home from work, you eat, probably while watching TV or scrolling on your phone, then you start watching something on Netflix. From what I can tell, the content of Netflix is 90% excruciatingly boring. So at some point you get bored. You probably choose one of those TV shows like Criminal Minds that have 79 seasons, and thousands of hours to watch. And then you get bored, and then maybe you take out your phone, and then you, with one part of your mind, you're paying attention to the TV show, the other is scrolling, and right there, when you split your attention like that, that's where anxiety can already creep in. But you're sitting there still, so you become bored. Your mind starts wandering. You start thinking about how much time you have to spend with your kids, because you'll feel guilty if you don't. But you're also tired, but there's like a million things to do. But then you have to take the dog to the vet, and you have to help your husband, and then there's something for work, and how minds do these things. So it goes in all directions at the same time. Difficult emotions start arising, tension, anxiety. It doesn't have to even be a well-defined emotion, but it becomes quite difficult to be with. It becomes very difficult to bear. And then the desire to avoid creeps in slowly. And then as a way of avoiding this cognitive and emotional mess, you start pulling. Why pulling, you say? I will explain that in the next slide. I think it's a very curious thing, hence the question mark. Because what usually happens is that people continue sitting there, continue being bored, their minds continue to wander, and the cycle continues. You catch yourself pulling, you pull your hand down, and you don't change anything, and you continue. Why is it that someone would choose, like if you become aware that you're pulling, why not change something? Why sit there and continue to do this? And this is, I mean, it's a random example, but I think the reason why that random example came to my mind, it's because I hear it all the time, right? And then pulling itself will make you feel ashamed and guilty and frustrated and angry. That's more difficult emotions. So by sitting there, you're basically feeding the cycle in two different ways. By staying in the same situation, you're feeding it by creating more boredom, and by being upset with yourself and hard on yourself because you just pulled, you're creating more difficult emotions. So here's another entry point where you're feeding your pulling. Kind of diabolical, isn't it? So what's the question mark about? If boredom is an invitation to change, to do something differently, what's the benefit of pulling in a situation like that? And the short answer is that pulling allows you to maintain the status quo. So by pulling, you're alleviating some of the tension that's produced by that cycle that I described, even if it's just the physical component of it, without actually having to do anything differently. I know pulling is not a good thing to do, but then the question is, why would you want to continue doing things differently? Because if that's what you choose, obviously there has to be some logic behind it, right? The very benefit of status quo, of continuing to sit there in front of the television by freely, quote unquote, choosing to watch Netflix, you're really living still in a very predictable and safe world. If your job is stressful, I mean, life is just stressful. Just look at the last 2 or 3 years. It's just messy all around. So having structure to your day is important, because structure gives us this sense of safety. If your life looks, at least from Monday to Friday, work, TV, shower, sleep, and repeat, that's safe. That's comforting. That's predictable. That's good. We'll like it. Our brains like it when they can predict what's going to happen. So even though boredom is not pleasant, even though pulling
this
is
is
not
the
good,
moment where
there is a great incentive
last
in
night
staying safe
during the live
and staying
webinar.
within your
So I'm
routine.
recording this
If you remember,
after the fact,
if you've ever taken
just to get you
psychology
at
in
least
high
a rough
schools,
impression of what I was
that's still
going
taught in high
to
school.
say. My apologies if everything doesn't sync up with the slides. I'm not
really quite sure how to do that. So I'll just give you the gist of what's left here. What I meant to say in the part that no one could hear was that the reason why safety and predictability are so important is that they represent some of our most basic needs. If you take a look at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you can actually Google it and find an image of it. You will see that for him, being safe and protected in that very basic fundamental way is really at the bottom of the of his pyramid, meaning it's a core need. Before you get to the top, you first have to satisfy those needs at the bottom. So by not changing the way that we structure our days, we are actually protecting that sense of safety. Even when we are lulled into something that's not necessarily pleasant, we are still nonetheless safe, and that need is taken care of. So now I would like to tell you a few words about a constructivist approach, or rather a potential constructivist approach to boredom. Again, I'm hoping the slide will change at about this time. I'm not quite sure if it has or it hasn't, since this is an audio recording and I will embed it in the video later on. But anyway, in personal construct psychology, which is a kind of constructivist psychology that I particularly like, it was invented by the man whose picture will be on the right side of the slide once you get to a slide called A Constructivist Approach, George Kelly. And Kelly, I guess it's fair to say that we can infer some connections between boredom and anxiety in his theory, similar to those that Heidegger, for example, pointed out. So for Kelly, emotions aren't actually anything more than just information. In fact, in his theory, he makes an effort to find a completely new vocabulary to talk about human psychology. So Kelly tries to avoid using the word emotion because it's a loaded term used by lay people, by different theories, so it basically means very little, if anything. And instead, Kelly introduces this term called transition, or a transitional state, to describe human emotions. So for him, an emotion would actually be an information that comes from your own psyche, that you're in the process of changing, or that something is about to change. So it points to a kind of need for development, or to a kind of malfunction of your system of constructs. Constructs, like that word, the word construct sounds fancy, but it's very easy to explain. For Kelly, constructs are the way in which we structure our experience. So it's how we abstract patterns from what happens to us. Constructs are what gives meaning to things, and then when we give meaning to things, events, or people, then we know exactly how to behave. So it's not some mysterious, difficult theoretical concept to grasp. For Kelly, anxiety is something that we feel when we realize that we're facing an event or a situation or something that we can't make sense of. So anxiety as a piece of information tells us that we don't have an appropriate construct. So it points to a construct missing, and therefore it invites us to carefully look at the event that we're dealing with in order to kind of create constructs, to construe the event. Boredom is similar but inverse to this. If anxiety tells us that we are missing a construct, then boredom tells us that we're missing an element. Right, so an element appears, it falls into a construct. You can imagine construct as kinds of bins or shelves or something like that. Like it finds its place, and then you know how to act based on that. Whereas when you're bored, all the elements are arranged in such a way that the system becomes static. So you need an element that will get your system moving. Because for Kelly, once our system stops moving, that's pretty much like dying. Not literally, of course, but symbolically. Because constructivists in general see the world as this place that's always in motion, always in flux, so always changing. And then they look at the human psychology as something that always has to change and always has to update itself. And in that sense, we can see boredom as an information that we are actually in dire need of updates. That spontaneously our system has stopped changing. That there is nothing to move it forward. Nothing to expand the meaning that we can attribute to the world. So anxiety tells us you're missing a construct. Boredom tells us you're missing an element. And then from that you can create, let's say, meaningful action. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this slide, what to do about boredom, because I just explained what I meant there. And then I'm going to give you a few practical examples on how to deal with boredom. You can read everything that I've listed here. Those are just some suggestions that then you can modify and adjust to yourself. But I think it would be maybe more useful if I give you a method, like what to do when you figure out that you're bored. So for this, all you need to do is remember the word stop. We'll use this as an acronym that will tell us step by step how to deal with boredom. S in stop actually stands for stop. So when you're bored by something, it means that this activity is no longer for you, or at least not in that particular way. So stop. That's the first thing you do. Then what you need to do is take care of the physical arousal that boredom creates. So we go to the T. So S is for stop, T is for take a few deep breaths. You can actually sit down and do a whole breathing exercise, something like box breathing, for example, or 3x3 breathing. So one of these. So take a few deep breaths. That will calm your body down. But at the same time, doing a breathing exercise for 3 or 4 minutes tends to slow your mind down as well. So the mind wandering that happens in boredom might also slow down. So S for stop, T for take a few deep breaths, and then O is for observe. When I say observe, what I mean is all these thoughts that you're having, what do they have in common? What is the theme that keeps repeating itself? Because that theme might be indicating something about what you need. What do you feel in your body? If there's still anxiety, maybe what you need is an activity that would calm you down. If you're feeling like you're tired, then maybe you need an activity that is restful. If you're feeling, if you're feeling like your body needs movement, then here's an actionable thing. Your body needs movement. So just by observing what's happening in your mind and in your body, you should have a good idea about sort of where to go next. And then P in stop is for proceed, which is go with what you've decided in the previous step. So stop. S for stop, T for take a few deep breaths, O for observe, and then P for proceed. This is like a general recipe. Now, in certain instances, you might have to compromise with yourself. For example, when I finish my work, sometimes my brain feels like mush, and I can't really think. So it's not an option to do something like read a philosophy book, right? That's not happening. But at the same time, because my work involves sitting, as I assume most other people's jobs, that means that my body is not tired at all. In fact, my body has been sitting all day. So my body and my mind have clashing needs. And then what I need to do is find an acceptable compromise. Find something that will mobilize my body a little bit so that it satisfies its need for movement, while at the same time not making myself think or function in a way that makes my mind more tired. Right, so then your task is to answer that question. What would satisfy both my mind and my body at this time? So those would be some ideas. Because I'm recording this after the fact, I'm going to stop now, just because I'm not sure how much time I have left before this additional recording becomes longer than the video. If you have any questions or need any suggestions, please email me, especially in this case, since there was a technical issue. My email is vladimir@trickstop.com. So thank you for your attention, and once again, apologies for the technical issue.